Welcome to the debate. There's this classic trap in architecture where someone decides to knock down a load-bearing wall just because they want an open concept living room. They look at the floor plan, they see a line that seems unnecessary, and they just think, "Oh, I can just tear that out."
Right, like if the ceiling sags, I'll just, put a steel beam in later.
Exactly. And for a few days, the space looks incredibly sleek. You have all this extra room, the blueprints look super efficient on paper, and you feel like an absolute genius.
Until the ceiling actually starts bowing and the door stops closing properly.
Yeah, and suddenly you're paying triple the original cost to have contractors rush in and literally jack up the roof before the whole house collapses. We are watching this exact architectural disaster play out across the corporate landscape right now. But instead of knocking out load-bearing walls, companies have been hastily knocking out their human workforce.
Assuming artificial intelligence was just going to be the magical steel beam that held everything up.
Right, and right now, corporate America's roof is absolutely caving in. Over the last 2 years, companies rushed to fire huge swaths of their workforce to replace them with AI, and now, well, the data is showing a massive frantic reversal.
It's pretty staggering. Looking at the latest Robert Half research, over 30% of U.S. hiring managers who eliminated positions for AI are now frantically reinstating those exact roles.
Wait, 30%?
30%. And it's only going to accelerate. I mean, Gartner is predicting that by 2027, half of all companies that cut customer service staff for AI will need to rehire them. Half.
So we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question here. When companies are scrambling to rehire people they literally just fired, what actually went wrong? Is this fundamentally a technological miscalculation? Like, did they just understand what the software could actually do?
Or is this, a systemic failure of organizational governance and leadership?
Right. So I will argue that this crisis stems from a massive conceptual error about technology adoption. Specifically, executives completely misunderstood the difference between using AI as a substitute for human labor versus a complement to it.
Symptom. The real disease here was a profound, systemic breakdown in organizational governance, feedback loops, and basic procedural justice.
Okay, well, let me lay out why I see this primarily as a technological failure. We have to look at how executives actually conceptualized AI over the last couple of years. They fell victim to the trap of substitutive technology adoption.
Meaning they thought it was a one-to-one swap?
Exactly. The implicit assumption in boardrooms was that an algorithm could execute a one-to-one replacement of a human worker. But if you look at, decades of economic research on productivity, I'm thinking of Bryn Jelfsen and Rykoffi here, sustainable gains almost always emerge when new tools augment human capability.
When they act as a complement, not a replacement.
Yes, but executives thought AI was somehow ready to replicate human judgment. They assumed these algorithms could just seamlessly handle contextual knowledge and relationship management. I mean, think about chatbots.
Oh boy, the chatbots.
Right? The research from Huang and Rust is incredibly clear on this. A chatbot can process a routine return policy perfectly, but they fail catastrophically the moment an interaction requires nuance or emotional intelligence or complex inquiry. The layoffs happened because decision makers fundamentally misjudged the technological boundary.
I see your point about the technology, but I come at it from a different way. I don't disagree that executives misunderstood the software, but to say that's the primary cause gives leadership entirely too much credit.
Too much credit? How so?
What frames this as an innocent analytical error, right? Like they just misread a white paper and made a bad math problem. I think it was hierarchical hubris. The real issue here was a profound failure of organizational learning, drawing directly on Edmondson's work on psychological safety.
You're talking about the idea that employees need to feel safe speaking up without fear of punishment.
Exactly. Because do we really think the frontline workers didn't know these AI systems were failing? Of course they knew. They were the ones watching the customer complaints escalate. They saw the quality deteriorating in real time.
Sure, but if leadership doesn't understand the technology's limits, they might just dismiss those complaints as, standard growing pains.
But they deliberately ignored those early warnings because the organizations lacked that psychological safety. Executives were completely fixated on the hype cycle. They just wanted to cut payroll. The failure wasn't a misunderstanding of code, it was the deliberate deployment of unproven systems without rigorous pilot testing.
So you're saying they knew it might fail and just didn't care?
I'm saying they pushed it through without protective feedback channels and without any real ethical oversight. It was a failure of how the organization actually governs itself.
Okay, I'm not totally convinced by that line of reasoning, because if we drill down into what actually caused the operations to grind to a halt when these workers were let go, the mechanics strongly support the technological miscalculation theory. The primary damage came from the evaporation of institutional knowledge.
How so?
Well, according to Argode and Miron Spector, when you cut experienced workers, you don't just lose a physical body in a seat doing a checklist of tasks. You lose tacit knowledge.
The unwritten stuff.
Right, the experiential understanding of how to solve complex edge case problems that simply aren't in the company manual.
Let's look at the media companies that try to automate their content production. They assumed generative AI could just step in and produce equivalent articles.
Oh, right, the infamous AI-generated articles that ended up being completely factually inaccurate.
Exactly. The systems generated text that sounded incredibly confident, but was entirely hallucinated. Why? Because algorithms are just trained on pattern matching. They just look at what words usually follow other words. They don't actually know what they're saying.
No. What they lack is editorial judgment, the human ability to dictate which stories actually matter, which sources are trustworthy, and what context a reader actually needs. To go back to our architectural analogy, institutional knowledge is the unseen structural foundation of a house.
You don't realize its value until you rip it out.
Precisely. If bad governance was the sole issue, why did operations completely collapse even in companies that attempted really slow, gradual AI rollouts? They collapsed because the contextual human judgment was just gone.
Okay, that's a compelling argument, but have you considered why that institutional knowledge evaporated so quickly? You're framing institutional knowledge as this, mystical substance that just vanished into thin air the second the tech didn't work.
I wouldn't call it mystical. It's just embedded in the people.
Right, but organizations structurally engineered this destruction by systematically dismantling what Peter Grahn calls distributed leadership.
Wait, what do you mean by distributed leadership in this context? Are we just talking about firing middle managers?
Not just managers, but the entire human network. Distributed leadership is the idea that decision-making power isn't just sitting at the very top. It's spread out among various roles across the company. It's the connective tissue.
Okay, I follow.
Organizations didn't just replace frontline writers or basic customer service reps. They actively gutted the coordination roles. They wrongly assumed that an automated dashboard or workflow software could just automatically replace the human networks that navigate competing priorities.
You mean like the people who actually know who to call in a different department when something breaks?
Exactly. Institutional knowledge doesn't just live in one person's brain. It lives in the connections between people who have the authority to make judgment calls. When companies deliberately flattened their organizational structures to optimize for incredibly narrow algorithmic metrics.
Like, how fast can we reduce payroll?
Yeah, exactly. They systematically took a sledgehammer to the human network that actually resolves ambiguous problems. The collapse wasn't just because the AI failed to replicate an individual's brain. It was because leadership made a deliberate structural choice to destroy the company's nervous system.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently, especially when we look at how companies are trying to dig themselves out of this hole. When we talk about how organizations actually rebuild from this rubble, the solution has to be grounded in redesigning workflows.
But redesigning a workflow doesn't fix a broken culture.
Look, you can't just mandate better governance or hire back managers and expect the system to magically work with the new AI tools. You have to fundamentally map the technological capabilities to the actual tasks. I'll be honest, when I first looked at the Shopify case, I was a bit confused.
Because they deployed fully automated customer support and it massively angered their merchants?
Yeah. Initially, I thought, well, if the AI is handling the sheer volume of routine tickets, why are the merchants so furious? But then you look at the mechanics. The AI couldn't handle complex business-critical problems, and merchants were getting stuck in these infuriating, endless loops.
Which is, I would argue, a classic governance failure. They rolled it out without a safety net.
But the fix wasn't just establishing an oversight committee. The fix was granular task analysis. They redesigned the workflows around human-AI complementarity. Let me give you an analogy.
Think of AI like an airplane's autopilot.
Okay.
In clear skies at cruising altitude, which in business means routine account inquiries and password resets. The autopilot is perfect. It's highly efficient. But the moment you hit a massive storm or a complex technical problem requiring actual empathy and negotiation, you need the human pilot to take the yoke.
And Shopify figured out how to separate the clear skies from the storms.
Exactly. They redesigned it so the AI systems manage the routine, while human specialists are deployed specifically for situations requiring emotional intelligence and complex troubleshooting. Crucially, they gave the human representatives the override authority.
So they could actually step in.
Right. They increased both efficiency and merchant satisfaction by properly placing the technological boundary. That is a design solution, not a governance one.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Redesigning workflows and drawing up these beautiful capability maps with autopilot analogies is completely useless if the displaced talent refuses to walk back through your doors.
Well, they're offering them their jobs back, right?
But why would they take them? The Robert Half data shows these companies are desperate to rehire, but put yourself in the shoes of a highly skilled worker. Why on earth should you return to an employer who just treated you as a disposable guinea pig for a failed automation experiment?
That's a fair emotional response.
Rebuilding fundamentally requires procedural justice. Drawing on Colquitt's research, procedural justice is the idea that people need to perceive the processes in an organization as fair and transparent.
So you're saying the workflow doesn't even matter?
I'm saying the workflow doesn't matter if you have literally nobody sitting in the chair to do the work. If you want that institutional knowledge back, you have to repair the deep betrayal and trust that you shattered. Let's look at Salesforce.
Okay.
When they realized they over-rotated on cuts and desperately needed to recover, it wasn't just about tweaking a workflow diagram. It required taking massive public responsibility for their miscalculation.
Right. They had to actively apologize.
They had to apologize, they offered enhanced severance to people they let go, they extended healthcare benefits, and they literally built alumni networks to try and maintain relationships with the talent they alienated. They had to prove they were fair.
Okay, but...
Or look at Klarna. They faced massive internal and external backlash for their AI layoffs. To recover, they didn't just redesign tasks. They had to implement technology review boards that actually included employee representatives. They had to create formal escalation paths for dissenting voices.
I see.
Without establishing a fair process and giving workers a voice, an organization loses its credibility completely. You can have the most elegantly designed human-AI workflow in the entire world, but if you've destroyed the psychological contract with your workforce, you have no one to staff it.
Look, I see why you think that, and repairing trust is absolutely necessary for crisis management. I won't argue that point. But trust doesn't prevent the next miscalculation. To prevent future failures, we have to return to a grounded understanding of the boundaries of algorithmic capability. Trust doesn't stop an algorithm from hallucinating.
No, but a governance board can unplug the algorithm when it does hallucinate.
But they need to know why it's hallucinating to fix the root cause. Let's look at the financial services sector. Several banks eliminated their human underwriting staff to deploy AI-powered loan decisioning. And what was the operational reality?
Disaster, I assume.
Complete disaster. The algorithms ended up approving loans that human analysts would have immediately flagged, generating massive compliance risks for the banks. Simultaneously, they rejected applications from highly creditworthy clients simply because their unique financial circumstances fell slightly outside the historical training data patterns.
Right, because AI only knows what happened yesterday.
Exactly. That is the fundamental technological limit. Machine learning operates purely on past data. It does not understand the nuance of the present context or unprecedented economic shifts. That is not fundamentally a failure of procedural justice. That is a failure to understand the tool you just bought.
Okay, but
The only way to prevent this going forward is to ensure technology adoption respects these boundaries. We have to keep human experts as the final decision makers on high-stakes, complex matters. The AI can detect patterns. It can serve as an incredible decision support tool, but a human must evaluate the recommendation. If you understand the technology's limits from day one, you don't make the bad layoff in the first place.
that's a compelling argument. But have you considered that a technological boundary only holds if there is an organizational governance structure strong enough to actually enforce it?
What do you mean? The boundary is the boundary.
Yes, theoretically. But in the real world, you are fighting against the overwhelming pressure of the hype cycle and quarterly earnings reports. Executives will always be tempted to push past the boundary of what the technology can do if it saves them a dollar.
Well, sure, there's financial pressure.
Let's look at United Airlines. They avoided a full-blown AI crisis, and it wasn't simply because an executive read a manual on algorithmic limits. It was because they institutionalized an early warning system.
Oh, how did they structure it?
When they deployed an AI customer service system, they didn't just flip the switch and wait 3 months for the financial metrics to roll in. They audited the system continuously. And they didn't just look at quantitative data, like resolution time. They actively gathered qualitative feedback from their service representatives and their high-value frequent flyers.
So they were actively seeking out the flaws.
Exactly. When they saw frustration starting to spike in real time, they adjusted immediately.
So they caught the problem before the ceiling caved in?
Precisely. They didn't have to fire 1,000 people and then frantically try to rehire them because they had a feedback system designed to catch failure early. This requires establishing technology oversight committees with the actual authority to pause or modify enterprise-wide deployments.
I see.
If you don't have diverse oversight boards that include skeptical perspectives, IT experts, and employee representatives, executives will always ignore the technological limits. A theoretical understanding of an algorithm means absolutely nothing with the institutional power to enforce accountability.
Which means we're looking at two very different paradigms for securing the future of work. Let's summarize where we stand. My position remains that the sustainable integration of AI relies fundamentally on a clear-eyed recognition of the irreplaceable nature of human contextual judgment.
Right.
Organizations that treat people as interchangeable with algorithms are paying a steep operational price because they fail to embrace a complementary approach to technology. Algorithms process to routine, humans manage to complexity. When we blur that line and when we fundamentally misunderstand the technology we are buying, operations inevitably collapse.
And I reiterate that acknowledging technological limits is entirely insufficient if you don't establish robust governance to check executive hubris. Procedural justice, psychological safety, and continuous learning systems are the only mechanisms that can prevent organizations from sacrificing their institutional knowledge on the altar of the latest hype cycle.
It's a structural issue for you.
Exactly. Reforming organizational power and decision-making structures is the necessary prerequisite for any technological transition. Without it, you're just going to repeat the exact same cycle of failure with the next shiny new software.
I think we clearly agree on one vital point here. Hype-driven automation is disastrous. Treating employees as disposable testing grounds for unproven technology creates profound operational and human costs. No matter the root cause, the damage to organizational memory and capability is just severe.
Very much agreed.
But our listeners will have to weigh the evidence to determine whether the most urgent foundational fix is better task capability mapping or deeper reform of how power, oversight, and feedback flow through an organization.
Exactly. And it's crucial to reflect on the profound implications we've discussed today. We are talking about long-term innovation capacity. The data shows that the workers who bore the brunt of this miscalculation were often mid-career professionals, precisely the people who hold the tacit knowledge required to navigate complex transitions.
Yeah, it's a huge brain drain.
It really is. This isn't just about corporate efficiency. It's about the dignity of work, who absorbs the risk of technological experimentation, and whether we are eroding the very human capital that drives sustainable prosperity. There is much more to explore regarding how businesses navigate this massive transition.
It certainly warrants deeper exploration. Which, brings us back to our house. Before you confidently swing a sledgehammer at a wall, you'd better be absolutely certain what is actually holding up the roof. Because as thousands of companies are discovering right now, you can't just buy a new foundation once the ceiling has already caved in.
A costly lesson in structural integrity, to be sure.